August 7th, 1944. Rural France. 0412 hours. A Sherman tank ceases to exist. Not damaged, not disabled. Gone in the time it takes to exhale. The 88mm round entered through the front plate, found the ammunition store, and converted 30 tons of American steel and 4 American men into a column of fire visible from 3 miles away. The crew never transmitted a distress call. There was no time for one. The German gun crew didn't move their position. They didn't need to. Again, another Sherman, another fireball, another 4 men who would never see Ohio or Georgia or Tennessee again. Again, 7 Shermans, 11 minutes, 1 Tiger tank, stationary, unhurried, methodical, and then American intelligence confirmed something that turned the stomachs of every Allied commander in France. 72 of them were coming, not scattered across the front, not held in reserve, concentrated and aimed directly at the path of the most dangerous American general Germany had ever faced, George S. Patton and his Third Army. German High Command had done everything right. Their intelligence was precise. Their positioning was textbook. Their firepower calculations were not optimistic. They were mathematical. On paper, this was the moment the Wehrmacht stopped Patton's rampage cold and bought Germany enough time to rebuild a collapsing Western Front. What happened instead became one of the most studied tactical catastrophes in armored warfare history. Fewer than 10 Tigers survived. The rest were destroyed, captured, abandoned, or blown apart by their own crews to avoid the humiliation of surrender. And Patton's Third Army never slowed down, not for a single hour. But here's what the history books almost always miss. The reason this failed wasn't firepower. It wasn't luck. And despite everything you've read, it wasn't simply Patton's audacity. It was a decision made in the dark, before dawn, on the morning of August 7th, that Patton's own senior staff called reckless. One of his commanders put it in writing, "This will get every man in the advance column killed." Patton overruled him. That decision didn't just survive the morning, it shattered the Tiger's myth permanently. It rewrote how America fought armored warfare, and it introduced a new kind of fear into the German Armored Corps, one they had never experienced before. For the first time, Tiger crews weren't hunting, they were being hunted. This is the story that gets buried beneath the legend of the man. And to understand why that decision was so extraordinary and why it worked when it had no right to, you have to first understand what American tank crews were living through in the summer of 1944. Because by August, the liberation that had followed D-Day wasn't a triumph. It was a slow, grinding, blood-soaked crawl through one of the most unforgiving fighting environments of the entire war. If you find this kind of forgotten courage as fascinating as we do, we'd be honored if you'd hit that subscribe button. We believe these stories of defiance and sacrifice deserve to be told. And by subscribing, you help ensure they aren't forgotten. The summer of 1944 in France was brutal. The liberation everyone had celebrated after D-Day had curdled into a bloody stalemate in the hedgerow country of Normandy. And American tankers were dying in ways that felt less like war and more like execution. The Tiger had been doing this since North Africa. By the time it arrived in France, it wasn't just a tank. It was a reputation, a psychological instrument as much as a mechanical one. Allied crews had passed the stories around long enough that the word Tiger, whispered over radio, spotted in an intelligence report, could freeze an entire column before a single shot was fired. The numbers justified the fear. The Tiger I weighed 56 tons. Its frontal armor was nearly 4 inches of hardened steel, thick enough that most Allied anti-tank rounds at combat range didn't penetrate it. They bounced. The 88mm gun it carried could destroy a Sherman from over a mile away. The Sherman's own gun, firing back at the same distance, would leave a scorch mark and nothing more. In direct engagements, a single Tiger routinely destroyed 3, 4, 5 Shermans before sustaining critical damage, if it sustained any at all. German commanders understood what they had. They positioned Tigers at choke points, on elevated ground, at the mouths of roads, not just to destroy Allied armor, but to stop it from moving entirely. One Tiger had just killed 7 Shermans in 11 minutes. 72 were coming. Most commanders, handed intelligence reports describing 72 Tiger tanks in their path, would have paused. They would have consolidated supply lines, requested air support, prepared defensive positions, waited for reinforcements, done everything the military manual prescribed for an encounter with overwhelming armored force. George S. Patton was not most commanders. Operation Cobra had broken the Allied stalemate in Normandy in late July 1944, and Patton's newly activated Third Army had punched through the gap like a fist through wet paper. In days, his forces had covered ground that other units had spent weeks dying for. The breakout was real, and Patton had no intention of letting it breathe. His philosophy wasn't complicated. He'd stated it plainly, repeatedly, to anyone who'd listen. Never let the enemy recover. Never give him time to think. Speed, in Patton's doctrine, wasn't recklessness. It was a weapon. A moving army was harder to target, harder to encircle, harder to stop than a static one. Every hour of hesitation was a gift handed directly to the enemy. Time to reposition, reinforce, and rebuild what your advance had just destroyed. So when the Tiger reports came in, Patton didn't slow down. He accelerated. It was a decision that alarmed his own staff. His supply lines were already stretched dangerously thin. Fuel was becoming a daily concern. One serious armored engagement could stall the entire advance, but stalling was precisely what Germany was counting on. German high command wasn't panicking. They were calculating. The reports coming in from the Western Front were bad. Patton's advance had been faster and more destructive than anyone had projected. The defensive line was fragmenting. The window to stop the Third Army before it tore open the entire Western Front was narrowing by the hour. But they had an answer. And for once, they were confident in it. 72 Tiger tanks would be repositioned and deployed as a concentrated blocking force, not scattered, and not divided, but massed, placed on defensible ground with long sight lines, coordinated infantry support, and supply lines secured behind them. The Tigers would anchor the line, absorb Patton's advance, and turn it into exactly the kind of engagement they were designed to dominate. Static, direct, brutal. The math was clean, almost elegant. Sherman's attacking fortified Tiger positions across open ground wasn't a battle. It was arithmetic. Every variable favored Germany. Firepower advantage, armor advantage, positioning advantage. American crews would be forced into frontal confrontations they couldn't survive, and Patton's momentum would die in a graveyard of burning steel. Intelligence confirmed the American supply lines were stretched. Fuel was already a problem. One sustained engagement, even a costly one, might be enough. The plan was textbook. The positioning was precise. The outcome, by every conventional measure of armored warfare, was as close to certain as war allowed. There was only one variable nobody had properly accounted for. Patton had no interest in fighting the battle they'd planned for him. The terrain changed first. As Patton's forces pushed beyond the hedgerow country of Normandy, the tight, claustrophobic kill zones that had strangled Allied armor all summer began to open up. The ancient earthen walls that had compressed every engagement into a blind ambush corridor gave way to rolling fields, wider roads, and sight lines that stretched for miles. It was the battlefield the Germans had planned for. What they hadn't planned for was how Patton intended to use it. American units didn't advance into the Tiger positions the way German commanders expected, in columns along predictable routes, forcing the direct confrontations the 88-millimeter guns were waiting for. Instead, they moved laterally. They used terrain features for cover, probed flanks, and refused to commit armor where Tigers had clear sight lines and established fields of fire. When direct engagement became unavoidable, they didn't send tanks alone. Artillery suppression came first, not to destroy, but to blind and disrupt. Tank destroyers, faster and lower than Sherman's, worked the angles. Air support hit supply convoys and repositioning columns when weather allowed. Infantry threaded into positions that armor couldn't reach. What had been designed as a duel became something else entirely. This was no longer strength against strength. It was a system, flexible, adaptive, and constantly shifting, being applied against a force that had been built to win a very different kind of fight. The Germans had prepared for a battle of firepower. What arrived was a battle of pressure, and the Tigers were already starting to crack. The Tigers' greatest weakness had nothing to do with armor penetration. It had to do with movement. At 56 tons, the Tiger I was an engineering achievement built around a single assumption, that it would fight from prepared positions, on ground it had chosen, against enemies advancing into its guns. It was designed to stand still and destroy. What it was not designed for, what its drivetrain, its tracks, and its fuel consumption made brutally difficult, was sustained, reactive movement across contested ground. Patton's army was forcing exactly that. As American forces refused to attack predictably, German Tiger units were ordered to reposition, then reposition again, then again. Each movement placed enormous stress on mechanical systems already operating at the edge of their tolerances. Track pins sheared. Final drives, notoriously fragile under load, began to fail. Engines overheated. Fuel, already difficult to deliver through disrupted supply lines, disappeared faster than anyone had projected. Tigers began to die without being hit. Some broke down mid-repositioning and couldn't be recovered. Others ran dry and sat stranded in fields, crews waiting for fuel that never arrived. A few were destroyed by their own men, charges placed in the engine compartments, hatches blown, rather than left intact for American forces to capture. The psychological shift was quiet but devastating. These crews had spent years as the most feared force on any battlefield they'd entered. Now they were sitting in disabled machines, watching their own tanks burn from the inside. The hunters were becoming a liability. Somewhere along the timeline of those August days, the fear changed sides. It happened gradually, then all at once. American forces had identified the pattern. The Tigers couldn't fight what they couldn't find, and they couldn't survive what they couldn't fuel. So instead of hunting tanks, Allied units began hunting trucks. Supply convoys were intercepted. Fuel depots were hit by artillery before delivery columns could reach forward positions. Communication lines were cut, rerouted, cut again. Orders from German high command began arriving late, then confused, then not at all. Tiger units that had deployed expecting coordinated support found themselves operating in isolation. No infantry screen, no resupply, no clear picture of where the American advance actually was. Commanders who had been trained to hold ground and dominate found themselves being asked to react constantly to a battle that kept refusing to take the shape they needed it to take. Requests to withdraw began appearing in German field reports. Then something happened that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. A Tiger, fully intact, operational, undamaged, was found abandoned by the side of a road. No battle damage, no mechanical failure that couldn't be addressed. The crew had simply left, whether from exhaustion, isolation, or the creeping recognition that their position was hopeless. They had walked away from the most powerful tank on the Western Front. It was a small moment, tactically minor, but symbolically it was everything. The weapon that had been a psychological instrument of German dominance had become evidence of German collapse. It didn't take weeks. That was the part that stunned German commanders most. The force they had assembled, 72 of their most powerful tanks, carefully positioned, mathematically overwhelming, came apart in days. Not in one dramatic engagement, not in a single climactic battle that history could point to and name, but in a rapid, relentless sequence of smaller collapses that fed each other until there was nothing left to hold. A Tiger destroyed by flanking tank destroyers after artillery suppression stripped its infantry cover. Another immobilized by a track failure during repositioning, abandoned when the recovery vehicle never arrived. A third caught by American air support on an open road, burning beside the fuel convoy it had been waiting for. Then another, and another. German reinforcements were committed. Armored vehicles and infantry pushed forward in a desperate attempt to stabilize the line. They arrived into the same collapsing system, the same fuel shortages, the same disrupted communications, the same relentless American pressure that gave no position time to solidify. Within days, the operational count told a story that German high command could barely process. Of the 72 Tigers deployed to stop Patton, fewer than 10 remained combat effective. The rest were destroyed, captured, abandoned, and were scattered across the French countryside as burning monuments to a plan that had made perfect sense on paper. And through all of it, every engagement, every collapse, every desperate German attempt to reestablish a line, Patton's Third Army never stopped moving. Not for a single hour. Patton's Third Army didn't pause to celebrate. There was no ceremony, no moment of reflection. The advance simply continued, deeper into France, faster than German commanders could respond, tearing open a Western front that never fully stabilized again. What had been designed as the decisive counterstroke that bought Germany time instead accelerated the very collapse it was meant to prevent. The battle entered the military history books quietly. The Tiger remained legendary, its silhouette still synonymous with mechanical dominance. In its reputation preserved in museums, documentaries, and the memories of men who had faced it and survived. But the specific story of August 1944, the story of 72 Tigers deployed with mathematical certainty and dismantled without a single decisive engagement, rarely claimed the spotlight the broader legend did. Perhaps because the lesson it contained was uncomfortable. Germany had built the most powerful tank on the battlefield, had deployed it in concentration, with preparation, with every advantage doctrine could provide, and lost, not to a superior weapon, but to a superior approach, to speed where they expected hesitation, to flexibility where they had planned for rigidity, to a commander who refused to fight the battle they had designed for him. The Tigers were built to be unstoppable. They were defeated by something they had no armor against, an enemy who understood their weaknesses better than they understood their own strengths and who moved too fast to allow those strengths to matter. Germany never fully recovered its confidence in overwhelming force alone. History rarely forgets that lesson, even when it buries the story that taught it.